Welcome everybody to our webinar partnered by Scanmarket. Today's session forms part of our Q2 series and is the final session in our Q2 series, looking at gaining a competitive advantage through change and transformation. Throughout the series, our partners and experts have been looking at how procurement can change and what can be done differently in order to add further value to the business. My name is Caroline Dillon. I manage content for Procurement Leaders, and in today's webinar, we will be focusing on how to strive for success by driving adoption and change management through digital transformation. I am absolutely delighted today to be joined by an amazing panel. We have Dan Jansfreda, who is Director of Customer Success at Scanmarket, and we also have our very own Alex Johnson, Principal Analyst for Procurement Leaders. Right, before we get started, I would like to draw your attention to some of the icons that you will be able to see at the bottom of your screen. The two main ones I want you to worry about at the moment are our technical difficulties one. So as in, like, if there's any technical glitches or whatever, please use the help button. We will do our best to sort this out for you. And the other very important one that I want you guys to be aware of is the Q&A button. So this is what you will be using to submit your questions to our panel today. Don't wait until the end of the session, all right? We want to hear from you. We want to get your feedback. We want to hear what kind of challenges you guys are going through. If there's anything specific that our panelists are covering that you want us to elaborate, please just put it in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to all of your questions. Right, and with that, I think, Dan, Alex, I think we're all good to go. So, Alex, I would like to get started with you. So to help offer us a little bit of context, Alex is going to take us through some of Procurement Leaders' latest research on our topic today. So, Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and thanks to Dan, and thanks to everyone else for joining us today. So I'm really excited about this webinar. There's a few reasons for that, but I think one of the aspects is the kind of topic. You know, so what we're talking about with on this slide, the big letters, the two words to focus on, I guess, is that solution mindset piece. And what we're really talking about today is how you sort of translate purchasing a piece of technology to that piece of technology being a meaningful solution to a set of business problems. And that isn't necessarily a natural trajectory in all circumstances. And you've seen a lot of the kind of copy, a lot of the presentation title itself, a lot of the focus around change management. And certainly if you think about that process of turning a purchased piece of technology into a solution, change management is quite key there, about embedding it into workflows, for example, ensuring people can use a full range of functionalities. Communication strategy is very central to that. You can see how change management is a core component, but it isn't all of the story. Another major component, for example, is partnership models. So how can digital project teams partner more effectively with solution providers? When we think about how we transition, again, to that solutions and mindset piece. I think why it's quite exciting to have Dan on the call and that solution provider perspective, we're almost coming at this from two angles. We're looking at what procurement teams perhaps need to establish as part of their change management, their partnership strategies. But actually, Dan's also providing us with challenge points, effectively. How should we be challenging solution providers to service us? And I think that binary, approaching it from two angles, makes a really interesting webinar. So thanks very much again, Caroline, for inviting me.
You're very welcome.
And the reason we want to talk about this topic, we see, on an ongoing basis, really, problems with procurement teams achieving desired levels of return on investment from the solutions they're purchasing. But actually, we're also seeing, as part of that, I suppose, quite a high project failure rate. You can see that quite damning statistic on that slide there, that 38% leading or contributing to a failed digital project over the last 12 months from a recent survey that we put out. And actually, there's a bunch of reasons that figure is quite high, but quite a lot of them go back to this idea about a solutions mindset. Some of those challenges, again, around change management, governance. I see that represented with those sort of smaller graphics to the right there. 64% identifying poor change management as a barrier to success of their digital projects. And when you look into that 64% figure, what that represented was quite interesting. So that was not only change management being under-resourced, that was some procurement functions feeling they didn't have enough expertise around change management, didn't have a communication strategy, or that resourcing was squeezed out as projects progressed, which was another a major issue. Perhaps the most interesting takeaway from those discussions were sort of thematic issues. So one topic which kept reoccurring was that communication strategies were often overly focused on the benefit it would deliver to a small spectrum of procurement leadership professionals. And perhaps that didn't reflect a communication strategy which would be appealing to stakeholders or procurement practitioners. And therefore, these teams were sort of struggling with buy-in, particularly as they rolled out their solutions. Another aspect, that 71% figure there, 71% identified poor governance as a major bottleneck. So unclear responsibilities, unclear accountability, and that took a bunch of forms. You saw some procurement functions which didn't have project planning documentation at all, or those documents were out of date. We often saw these projects being run with inadequate understanding of responsibilities and accountabilities within the project team. Another serious issue was around executive sponsorships. Often there wasn't an executive sponsor at all, or at least not a formalised one, or that those executive sponsors were not suitably invested in the project. And that became particularly tricky when it came to resourcing. You also see that 46% figure there, as in being identified as a skills gap, basically being a major bottleneck. And there's almost two levels to that, I suppose. So the first level was around the actual rollout of these solutions. And those expertise, as mentioned, were things around like a lack of knowledge about how to roll out digital projects, for example, a lack of knowledge around change management and communications. But actually there's a secondary aspect to that as well, which is when these solutions were live, often procurement teams lacked the ability to actually make full use of the capabilities of those solutions, or in a more abstract or higher level way, often struggled around particularly data analysis side. So when one of the big sort of, I suppose, value proponents when people talk about digitalization is around the ability to sort of turn data into insight. And in many cases, procurement functions weren't set up in a way that didn't have the right skill sets to do so. And actually, when we think about those challenges, it brings us back to a matrix we've been working with for a while at Procurement Leaders, thinking about different capability areas. And you can see them represented on this slide here. So how this effectively works is you reached out to mainly deep dive interviews. There was a small survey as well. It was around 100 organisations in total, and the senior-most individual in terms of having a digitalisation purview within those organisations. And from those discussions, we got a vision of what went into a holistic digital strategy. You can see that represented on the slide here with all these areas. And what was really interesting about that research is initially we assumed the bottlenecks or the barriers to procurement around digitalisation would be quite technical ones, so things like data accessibility, or we started with an undue focus on the actual tools that these teams had. What we discovered is a lot of the challenges they're actually facing were softer, so around areas like culture, for example, or some of the areas outlined on this slide here, which are often ones about process and project management. You can see we've highlighted change management, we've highlighted governance, we've highlighted process engineering, we've highlighted partnerships. And I don't want to focus too much on change management and governance, partly because we'll be covering it in the Q&A, but we've also spoken about that already. But to shift on to what we haven't mentioned so far, I think process engineering is a really interesting topic. So what we've discovered is that particularly in recent years, the sort of importance of process engineering and process standardization has become increasingly critical as procurement thinks about transitioning towards a sort of software as a service environment. And often procurement functions weren't really in a position to sort of transfer and translate what they were doing to something which is more ready for that sort of digitalization shift. So often procurement functions were still working with highly bespoke and unstandardized processes, which often didn't make a huge amount of sense considering the sort of technologies they were looking towards. So that process engineering has become an increasingly key pain point, something I think we'll be able to touch upon a bit when we look at what Dan's got to speak about as well. Partnerships, though, is the area we really wanted to focus on. Because again, I mentioned there's a sort of two components. There's this change management and governance piece, but also the need for procurement teams to be operating with more effective digital partnerships when it came to thinking what a solutions mindset actually meant. And what was really interesting when we approached this topic and we had a couple of research interviews, we found that there was a big difference in how top performers were approaching their digital partnerships and I suppose what we consider sort of laggards or organisations that were struggling a bit more around digital transformation. And partly, these less mature organisations were often treating the space a bit of a binary, a kind of make or buy decision. You know, either we buy a piece of technology or we build it ourselves. And there was a lack of awareness. There was actually a series of levels between those those two aspects in the binary. So that was things like, actually, can we be a more proactive customer? Can we influence vendor roadmaps? Can we engage in testing? Can we be involved in their sort of events? Can we build stronger relationships with these solution providers? And actually thinking through that transition became a really interesting way of thinking about the fact that we need to be building up those partnership capabilities, particularly as we shift towards, as mentioned, that sort of software as a service environment. On a deeper level, though, as we looked through those partnerships, and again, the sort of differentiation from those top performers, there are a range of ways that these organisations are operating very differently in terms of their digital partnerships. You see those broken into 3 buckets on this slide here. So strategic vision, partnership diversity, and partnership embeddedness. On the strategic vision side, there's almost 2 aspects. So one was there was often a transactional short-term mindset, which is sort of undermining a vendor selection. So when you look at top performers, they're far more aware of the need to be building these partnerships around a long-term vision. So did they have aligned roadmaps? Did they have aligned vision for how they expect procurement to evolve? Are these individuals we could be working with and building strong relationships with? Will they value us as a customer? And that was increasingly pivotal to them, and perhaps less important than the sort of functionalities they immediately had available. And you saw this sort of transition again as you looked up that maturity curve. The other aspect around strategic vision, though, was ensuring that procurement was actually working from a realistic vision of user requirements and business needs. And in many cases, procurement struggled to actually have an informed vision because it wasn't including enough stakeholders in that discussion. So whilst that seems a lot more internally facing, it has quite a significant implication when we think about our partnerships with solution providers to make sure we're working with a sort of accurate assessment of the business as is. And that went back to, actually, when procurement
It seems like we may have an issue there. Apologies, everybody. It seems we may have lost Alex. So whilst we are working on getting Alex back online, these are virtual events. These things always do happen. So apologies, everybody. Maybe, Dan, I realize Alex is still kind of midway through his presentation there, but if I could take it to you, maybe, based on what Alex has already covered, what would be your thoughts on this? Oh, there we go. Alex,
sorry.
Hello. We've got you back. I was about to take it to Dan, but you've come back at the opportune moment, so there you go. So as I was saying, we had lost you there for a second. So if you could take us back maybe to, you were talking about the strategic vision and you were about to move on to partnership diversity. So if you could kind of maybe take us back from that point, that would be amazing.
Great. Sorry about that. It's never a presentation about technology without some sort of issue about technology. Maybe there's a way we can embed that into our learnings at some point. I'll add to the takeaways. But yeah, on the partnership diversity side, there was 2 aspects to that. So one was actually we found that the less mature procurement functions tend to have a very, very narrow vision of the people they're willing to partner with. They often lacked awareness or appetite to work outside of a very small spectrum of the largest players. And that heavily limited their partnership opportunities. What was more interesting, though, was actually diversity in terms of the projects that those more mature organisations are looking towards. So we found that less mature procurement functions tend to overcommit to a single technology or solution at the early stage of their projects. So they'd effectively hand the solutions market a list of capabilities or a list of functionalities they expect them to address without recognising there's probably a range of ways you can solve for a series of business problems. And by bringing vendors into that discussion at a more strategic, earlier level, rather than defining the solution and reaching out to the market, they're in a much stronger position, particularly when you look at implementing more cost-optimal approaches to some of those business problems. And you actually see that's reflected quite closely in our data. So if you ask our members to review vendors, and we do this every couple of years, you'll tend to find functionality usage is the lowest scoring. And again, that is because of that checklist approach. That is because they've reached out to the market with a list of functionalities they want. And that doesn't really put them in an optimal position when it comes to actually co-defining a solution. They're missing out on a lot of the expertise that could be provided by the solution provider. Another aspect, which is really interesting, was around partnership embeddedness. So partly that's very concrete and obvious. That's around having strong relationships with solution providers that don't just sit with a small number of individuals. And when those individuals leave, those relationships end up being terminated or become significantly less efficient. Actually, thinking about how we embed that relationship as well as knowledge of how to use these platforms was something which really stood out. Another thing which I thought was, only a smaller number, but a really interesting finding we got from some of the most mature organisations was their basic approach to viewing a solution provider almost as an ecosystem. So that was an ecosystem of having auxiliary solution providers, that those relationships, there are already relationships between those vendors that are likely to work well together. But more interestingly, it was actually around customers. And an ecosystem of customers around the solution provider. So often these solutions are being used in really interesting ways, or they're being applied to interesting business problems, or the capabilities are being extended outside of the core capabilities of the platform. And by building that sort of ecosystem of customers and seeing how other people are using those solution providers, it puts you in a really interesting position when it comes to maximizing the value of those investments. So, and again, that feeds back to what we said about being a proactive customer. It's about attending customer events. It's about sort of building up your own networks around a solution provider. And that was something which really stood out. So I hope that's an interesting introduction. Sorry again for dropping off for a couple of minutes, Caroline. But I hope that sort of set the context a bit for our Q&A.
No problem, Alex, and it really did. Thank you so much, because that's what we wanted. We wanted to get a bit of an overview. So now, Dan, I will pass it on to you. I'm quite keen, obviously, as Alex mentioned earlier, we've got the great opportunity today where we've got, both sides. We've got Alex coming from, PL with, our procurement leaders kind of point of view. And then we've got you as well, who's coming more from the solution provider point of view. So I'm quite curious to hear what your thoughts are regarding, the areas that Alex has just covered.
Yeah, of course, Caroline. So, the research that Alex has just gone through there is no surprise at all to us. The fact that almost 40% of projects are failing in the marketplace doesn't surprise us. And there's probably many more that just aren't succeeding to the level they hoped. But what we see in the marketplace is that the majority of cases where the project has failed, it is exactly as Alex was saying. It's down to the fact that they're just not getting the change management, the adoption and the embedding elements right. And that can be for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons, and the most common ones, are, for example, and this wasn't mentioned by Alex, but that when they've rolled out the solution, they found actually that it's way more complex, clunky, and time-consuming for the buyers and or suppliers to use, which can obviously cause a huge amount of resistance, which can stop the program in its tracks before it's even started. Another one is what you've mentioned there about the gap, the skills gap. And that comes down a lot of the time to lack of training and lack of support from the provider. And we need to be better as providers to make sure that just doesn't happen. That just shouldn't be a reason for the failure of a project. But the main standout reason actually is just the fact that there's often just not enough focus and planning that goes into the change management program or into the change management aspect of it. So exactly what comes after the implementation, the post-implementation, the part of the process where the system needs to be truly and deeply adopted and embedded. And that's a real shame, because there's a huge amount of effort usually that goes into selecting the right provider by, first of all, making sure that they get all of the internal requirements listed, and then selecting the right provider, making sure implementation goes well. But then there's very little planning often for what comes immediately after that. And it's that point that can really be the difference between success and failure.
Yeah, definitely. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that. Obviously you've just mentioned the importance of, the selection of the provider and, the kind of like the lack of, the lack of investment in the change management. So why do you think all of this is? If you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, that's obviously some people are getting it right, and that's great. And some providers are supporting that process, which is great. But there's definitely an element, I think, where organizations just think that if they get the first three elements right, i.e. the internal requirements, if that's definitely if they've got a really clear vision of what that is, if they've selected the right provider and they get implementation right, I think they just think that the next bit will just come naturally. And it can occasionally happen, but it's certainly more the exception than the rule. There needs to be much more focus on this from both sides, in my opinion. And for me, the customer organization should be evaluating this in much more depth and scrutinizing exactly how the provider says they will support and drive adoption and embedding. In RFPs that we receive, we often see that there can be like literally hundreds of lines of very specific requirements regarding exact functionality and very specific functionality. hundreds of lines of requirements and questions regarding the technical characteristics and the security and performance, etc., of the system itself. And then lots of questions about implementation. But very rarely do we see real key sections on how the provider will ensure that adoption and embedding and ultimately the success. And that's really important because the software doesn't embed itself. And it's not the organization as an entity that embeds the software. It's the people within the organization who embed the software. And that can only come through change. And change is tough. And it needs to be taken very seriously from both sides. But ultimately, for me, it's down to the providers. They need to be the ones who are really driving this because we're the ones with the huge amount of experience and expertise in this area. It's our industry. We need to be at the forefront.
No, definitely. Alex, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I agree totally with a lot of what Dan said. Well, one of the things which really stood out to me in particular was I saw Dan's concept of the sort of ongoing change management approach. Basically, it's not just like a certain cut-off date and that's the end of change management. Often it's quite interesting. We see these sort of project plans. You know, the digital project goes live, that's it. And that's quite a surreal scenario to be in. Like often procurement teams aren't really taking enough ownership post-solution being deployed. These digital project teams disband, a lot of the accountability and ownership leaves. And often, as Dan said, they're on an ongoing basis. There isn't a huge amount of support. So when new individuals are rejoining the organisation, for example, or new functionalities are released, procurement functions aren't often in a very good place, I suppose, to ensure that those new capabilities become embedded.
Apologies, I seem to be having some issues on my end, but Dan, Alex, can you hear me there?
Yes,
perfectly.
Yeah. Apologies, there was a slight glitch. Apologies for that, but no, thank you so much, Alex. And yeah, I think I agree, and we've been talking a lot about the I guess this concept of responsibility. You both said it. Like there are different sides, and both sides, the customer and the provider need to take part. And actually, ahead of this webinar, we sent across a poll to gather our audience's opinion on this and, of who ultimately is responsible for driving a successful digital transformation project. And, we had the options of whether the responsibility should lie with the provider or the customer, or if it should be that 50-50 % partnership. And actually the latter was the one that people favored, with 71% actually of our voters favoring that 50-50 partnership option. But Dan, you mentioned that actually it's the responsibility of the provider really to drive success. But as we've seen from the poll and as what Alex has just mentioned, surely, I mean, it might not be possible if the customer isn't willing to commit to the change, or vice versa for that matter. So what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was really glad to see that it was so many people voted for 50-50, because I actually thought more people would vote for the fact that it was the customer who was responsible. I think you can clearly see that from what I've said so far, I'm of the opinion that it is the provider's responsibility. But yeah, I mean, in some cases, it's not possible for the provider to even, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but to drag the customer to success, because if they're not set up for it, if they're not willing to engage with the provider, if they're not willing to commit the resource and just not willing to focus on it, then yes, it can be an almost impossible uphill struggle. But there's so much that we can do as providers before we get to the stage where we're giving up. Providers should not just be implementing the solution and then leaving it to the customer, to their own devices, only there to offer reactive support when requested. We as providers should be, and I'll use the word maniacally, we should be maniacally and proactively driving adoption, usage and success on a daily, weekly basis. And many organizations that we speak to that go back to the market, as I mentioned earlier, they cite that there just hasn't been enough support from the provider, and that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, amazing results can be achieved through successful digitalization within procurement. And it's our responsibility not just to sell and implement the software and then leave it to chance whether the customer is going to achieve success or not, but to do everything in our power on a daily, weekly basis to drive and guide our customers to achieving those amazing results that can be had. Otherwise, I don't know what we're doing.
Agreed. Alex, do you want to comment on that?
No, that does make sense. I was thinking again, we spoke a bit about partnerships. Obviously, part of that's with the solution provider. I think Dan's made a very, very good case of solution providers often, not keeping their side, I suppose, of what that partnership looks like. But again, I'm going to point the figure in a slightly different direction and look at procurement functions, just because, again, they're the people we speak to rather than solution providers normally. But one of the other aspects of that partnership, which is often overlooked, I think, is procurement's internal partnerships and other functions. And particularly, IT is the first point, often finance as well when you look at the P2P space. But that partnership is also hugely important when it comes to thinking through our overall system strategy. And procurement functions tend to, particularly less mature ones, operate in a far too siloed manner when it comes to establishing that. And even when we think about change management and communications, if we want to extend that to internal partnerships, we've seen some of our members poach people from internal communication teams or marketing teams, for example, to help support building out that communication strategy. So I guess that's another angle we can look at this partnerships piece from a change management perspective as well.
Definitely, yeah, and actually, I'm quite happy that you mentioned that the change management aspect, because we are also getting quite a few questions there from our audience regarding the actual how to, because obviously we've established there needs to be a partnership on both sides, but what really can be done to drive this change management in order to get the right adoption and the embedding correct. So Dan, maybe we can go to you first, and then Alex, you can give us your thoughts.
Yes, I'm going to try my best to stay high level because I could wax lyrical on this topic for days. So I won't go into too much detail. I'll try not to anyway. Please rein me in if I go too far. But essentially, let's just start with the most important element is there needs to be true partnership. And we've said that, but I want to go into more detail. The walls need to come down between these two organizations, and they need to have an honest, true collaboration. Effectively, the two organizations merging as one within this area, who are supporting each other and helping each other with one goal in mind, and that is the success of this program. And it's the people from the customer side who need to trust the people from the provider side, because again, it's the people who bring about the change. They need to trust the provider. They need to know that the provider is there to genuinely make sure they're successful. And they need to understand that their success as a customer is our success as our success as a provider. Their failure is our failure. And they need to know that they're not going to receive a bill every time they ask for some support or every time we offer some support, but that we're in for the long run and that we're there to genuinely and wholeheartedly be focused on their success. So that's the first thing. And then within that, there needs to be like a multi-seniority level driving team from both sides. And that's to make sure that there's a great level of accountability and ownership, and then also strategic alignment. And I don't just mean a strategic alignment between the two organizations. I mean, sometimes within the customer organization, there's not strategic alignment within them at the different levels of the hierarchy. So they need to make sure that they're aligned and that we're all aligned together on what we're trying to achieve. Then we need to get into the detail. So we need to be able to understand exactly what the key objectives and challenges are, because it's not just about we need a tool and we need to implement a tool or we need to digitalize our program here. It's about the fact that there's some real key reasons why you want to do that. And we need to understand as providers, what are those key objectives? What are those key challenges? So that we can make sure that they are achieved or the challenges are overcome. We also need to understand the key success factors, the risk factors. We need to understand that there's pockets of resistance within the organization, etc. And from that, we need to be able to together and guided by the provider, create some measurable, tangible KPIs to help drive these behaviors, to put targets on them, to drive the behaviors, and then to be able to monitor the performance. And also it's about, by doing that, it's also about understanding upfront, what will success look like further down the road? We need to be able to know what success looks like and what that target is in order to be able to achieve it and to drive towards it. And then once we've got all that information, we need, as providers, to build a detailed plan regarding what needs to be done, when, who needs to be involved, who's driving what, etc. Just like an implementation plan, but more detailed, and it's a post-implementation plan, essentially a success plan with all of the workshops, all of the tactics, strategies, methodologies that we know as providers work, and tailoring that plan exactly to that customer to make sure that we plan for success and ultimately achieve it. And one of the key elements of that is that we need to, from a very early point, even before the end of the implementation process, is that we need to go around and win the hearts and minds of the people, the hearts and minds of the people within the organization. We need to break down the barriers, dispel myths, etc. And what I mean by that is, like, obviously not everybody in the organization who's going to be using the solution, who's going to be adopting it, was involved in the decision-making process. And that's fine, but it's also not the right thing to just say, right, as of Monday, we're using this solution, make sure you turn up for training, and that's it. We need to be able to win those hearts and minds by effectively working together again in that driving team, showing that we're a unit, and explain to the stakeholders, this is why, as an organization, we've chosen to digitalize this. It's because of the fact that best-in-class organizations, we've got third-party researchers that show that best-in-class organizations are leveraging this type of technology, and they're achieving X, Y, and Z, and we need to not be left behind. And then they also need to explain why they've selected that particular provider. Make sure people understand, we looked at the marketplace, we evaluated the market, and we selected this provider for this reason, and this reason. And ultimately, those reasons will be because they're, in our opinion, the best provider to help us and to help us achieve success. And I promise I'm coming to the end here. I said I wouldn't ramble for too long. There also needs to be, though, lots of tailored training and support. We need to make sure that we're taking into consideration all levels of tech savviness and different learning styles and different speeds at which people can learn new solutions. And then nearly last, but certainly not least, this is one of the key ingredients, is there needs to be a very clear top-down directive, passionate, involved support from senior management, explaining we're doing this together, this is why we're doing it, and we're going to be along the journey with you. We're going to be monitoring it, driving it, supporting it. It's an absolutely key project for us. Last couple of things is there needs to be regular review meetings. So, you can't just launch it and then just hope for the best. You need to be able to course correct. You need to be able to discuss what's going well, what needs to change, what needs to be enhanced, what needs to be tweaked, who needs more support, and to be able to course correct as you go along. And then the final element is the maniacal focus from the provider, the dedication from the provider, because it's not easy bringing about this change, and some people are more resistant than others, and with good reason. They're very busy people. They've got a stressful work life. They're trying to go about their jobs. Introducing this new solution can just be seen as an extra hurdle. We need to be really patient. We need to be really supportive and just really dedicated to continue to support people to get them where they need to be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. And actually, I think, your last point, I would kind of like to follow up on that in a sense where, as you said, it is it is the people, and we do need to support, the people there. And there are people who also will sometimes find this very challenging. You said it yourself. There are people who are incredibly busy and perhaps just don't want to do this change. But I was wondering, we've got a question, Alex, maybe this one more for you, where from our audience asking about, going also beyond, the internal struggles and looking as well at, the different regions where maybe, depending on cultures, depending on which region you're in, maybe there are some models that are actually more effective and some ways of approaching change management that are more effective. What have you seen in terms of, on your end, on the research side that could support this?
Yeah, sure. So something which Dan said, which really stood out, and something I agree a lot with, is almost who gets a voice. It's not just about saying we're doing this and that's the end of the message. Part of it's around, what role do we allocate? People talk a lot about change champions. I'm sure we don't have to go into the technical nature of, sort of change management approaches, but people look at the Kotter model and how it's evolved, for example. We've transitioned from this very heavy top-down approach to thinking more, actually, being more consultative, bringing people in from local sites. And actually, when we think about change champions or representatives, it's not just us giving them our change messaging. It's almost a two-way street. So it's giving these individuals the capacity to sort of suggest feedback, as Dan said, help out with course correcting, identify those pockets of resistance. It's a far more collaborative and consultative basis. And when you think about a sort of regional models, if you're trying to roll out in a very diverse across a very diverse geographic scope, you'll often find you might have to have focused change management approaches for those areas. So that involves understanding the sort of communication tools that are being used by those individuals, for example, ensuring you have representatives of those sites who are sort of strong proponents of what you're advocating for. And that's a really interesting transition. And when you look at, I've mentioned already the process engineering side and the need for sort of standardization, the shift for procurement function looking at standardization, that's very painful. When you look at all the different regulations and geographic needs of those locations, you try and roll out a solution, that can create a huge amount of tension, especially when you don't want to deviate much from your global template. So having those region-specific change management models, understanding actually for those sites, what does their workflow look like as it undergoes that transition, and focusing your communication strategy at that targeted site-based level or geographic level or regional level, depending on what you're operating at, will make a huge difference. So yeah, it's certainly something you need to consider.
Brilliant.
And if I may,
when we were go ahead, Dan.
Sorry, Caroline. Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the key differentiators I see in different regions is that when I use the word top-down directive, that can sometimes send a shudder down the spines of the people I'm speaking with, because it's just not within their culture, within their organization's culture. And sometimes that's regional, to use a word as strong or a term as strong as that. But it doesn't matter what the term is. It's more the message, the fact that there needs to be some senior guidance around the fact that, look, this would really help our organization if we achieve this. How can we work together to achieve this? Here's some solutions that we've put in place. It would be great if you could start running some of your projects through the tool. So, it doesn't have to be with the stick. It can be with the carrot. It doesn't have to be really strict, and it doesn't have to be the term top-down directive. But I just mean that senior management buy-in is really important. And that's just one of the examples that I've picked up on in terms of regional differences and cultural differences.
Completely agreed there, Dan. And I'm going to put you both a little bit on the spot, but you mentioned you mentioned that idea of basically that senior management buy-in, and it's quite often we do get the question from our membership of that is a huge challenge in terms of getting that buy-in. I mean, I would be quite curious, Alex and Dan, if you have any advice for our audience, because this is a recurrent question, and I know that in our conversations, for instance, Alex, you were talking about the need for being agile and things like that, but obviously the buy-in is a big obstacle. You can't get anywhere if you don't get it. So maybe Alex, you can respond first, and then Dan, feel free to comment.
Great. So sorry, Caroline, I lost sound very briefly again. But if we're talking about, but yeah, if we're talking about, I suppose that buy-in hurdle, I think I mentioned the thematic change in communication strategies and how often it used to be you looked at a digital roadmap or a presentation about a procurement digital transformation. They'd have things on slides like, full-time employee reduction, and that be being presented to category managers, and they're trying to get buy-in for their digital projects. Until you start to think about the sort of objectives and the messaging which actually appeals to individuals, it's no wonder they're not going to buy into those projects. And part of that is basically identifying the pain points of the individuals you're trying to deliver value for. So you often see project teams now engaging in a far more consultative set of milestones at the start of their projects. They're actually trying to identify what these stakeholders want from procurement, for example, or what issues are they currently having with procurement. And then when they're building the communication strategy, they're using the insight of those pain points to basically say, right, you should be buying into this, not because it's delivering value to procurement, but because it delivers value to you. And that's a very different way of structuring a communication strategy. But that thematic shift makes a massive difference.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. But it's not just about the senior management, and I'll go back to that in a moment. But it's at every level. Everybody needs to understand how it will help them by adopting the solution. Because if they're just doing it because they're being told to do it, then that's a real tough sell. If you're doing it because you're plugging into their objectives and their challenges, then you're becoming an enabler, and you're enabling them to do what they need to do anyway, but just in an easier, faster, better way. And that's absolutely key. But back to senior management. Senior management have targets, they have objectives that they need to achieve. So as long as we can use third-party research and also research and results from the provider, from talks that they can have with other organizations who are using that solution or using similar solutions. That's a really key way to make them, to get them on board and to help drive the project. So very much echoing what you're saying there, Alex. But again, I think that's the case at every level, is just make sure that we're speaking everybody's language and helping them understand how this is going to help them ultimately.
Yeah, just coming in on that, Dan, very quickly, something which I found a really useful practice. One organisation we work with were really struggling with that narrative piece. So what they did is they identified the strategic pillars of the business, not just procurement for 2025, and they directly associated all their objectives around those business objectives. And they presented that as the first slide of almost every presentation they presented on the project. And not only did that mean the project team had to try and deliver against those more strategic objectives, so it sort of kept them to that task. But it was a far more compelling sell to the business, not just to get buy-in in the first place to get the actual business case signed off, but actually as they rolled it out as well. It made it far more difficult to reject the enterprise's 2025 objectives than it is to tell procurement that you're not interested in their digital strategy.
Definitely. And we actually have an interesting comment from our audience which links directly to this in terms of, obviously we've covered quite, this in many occasions, even in one of our events, a couple of weeks ago, where, the tech transformation markets say that there's no one size fits all, there's no one solution fits all. And, you said it yourself, Dan, it's not just a senior management, it goes all the way, it trickles all the way down, and everybody needs to kind of be on board, and become that enabler. But one of our audience members is looking at the angle of, how change management, if the messaging could be that essentially the solution is not about solving 100% of your problems, but it's got advantages that are not directly visible to you and essentially can solve, the main problems, as you were saying, Alex, those pain areas. What are your thoughts on this? Alex, let's start with you.
Sure. So there's a few aspects to that which I find quite fun. So my favourite was, as I mentioned, procurement teams used to have these very tactical objectives. No one was interested, no buy-in. So some procurement functions shifted too far in the opposite direction, where they came up with these absolutely outrageous, over-the-top visions of how procurement would be in a couple of years' time and implemented technologies. And then when those objectives weren't met because they were completely unviable and impossible to achieve with technologies as is, there was a lot of, blowback from that. There's a lot of reluctance. You have to keep your objectives realistic. But something else, as you mentioned, like not solving all the problems of the business. Obviously, technology is not a silver bullet. We talk a lot about people, process, technology all being aligned. Another aspect of this, which I want to feed into because I think it's really interesting, is a sort of shift away from this view that a single suite is the way to resolve or treat a system strategy. And our research has shown a massive shift towards best-of-breed models. And that's partly reflecting actually what procurement means by a system strategy. It's now a very broad set of capabilities. Procurement want to apply technology to their risk management, their CSR, sustainability, product and service enhancement, finding innovation from the supply base. And when we're thinking about how a single system obviously can't deliver against absolutely all of those objectives, which has partly driven this sort of shift, I suppose, towards that best-of-breed model. So I suppose that's two angles to come at that question from, or that statement from.
Yeah, definitely. Dan, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would just say, I think it's very rare in life that we find anything that's a silver bullet that solves all of our problems. It's all about just getting incremental improvements. And that's what systems are there to do. Anybody who's going to say that the system's going to just make everything right in your life might be overselling somewhat. I think it's much more about the fact that you, as I said before, focus on the key objectives that you need to improve, and then make sure that you achieve those objectives, that you move the needle in that area with that solution. And yeah, I don't think it needs to be sold into the organization to say it's going to solve everybody's problems at every level, but it may solve certain people's problems more than others. But as long as we're still, right down at the user level who's using the tool every day, and that's where the main change takes place, as long as that's making their lives easier, more efficient, and that they've got better visibility, more control, etc., then the huge impact that it'll have up in senior management and the huge impact it'll have on bottom line and efficiency, etc., that all works together in harmony. So it's not that the solution has to solve everybody's problem at every level, but I do think if you just say to somebody, you need to go massively out of your way to do all these new admin tasks in this new solution that's not particularly easy to use and you're not going to get enough support on, and it's going to have zero benefit to you, I don't think that's the right message either.
No, definitely not. And I'm just conscious of time, so I want to actually move us on to another really big challenge. And Alex, you've mentioned this in your research. This is it's the skill gap. We've touched upon it a little bit, but I'd quite like to take a moment to develop on it. That this is a significant barrier, to the success of digital projects. So Dan, maybe we can start with you. What are your thoughts on this? And then Alex, I'll take it to you.
Yeah, again, my experience is totally aligned with that research and the fact that there's a skill gap a lot of the time from the organizations that are coming back out to the market who've had a failed project. And again, it's difficult for organizations to adjust to change because it's difficult for the people who are using it to adapt to that change. It's difficult for them to go from manual processes to digital. It's difficult for them to move from one system to another because, again, change is difficult. For some people, it'll come as second nature using a new solution because they may have used several solutions that are similar to that solution in the past, or they just may be really tech savvy. But then for others, it can be much harder. And I know, because I'm one of those others, I'm mercilessly mocked often within our organization for being a bit of a laggard with different technology solutions that we have to use. I'm talking about like some Microsoft solutions that we have to use. You don't want to ask my line manager about my ability within Salesforce and keeping that up to date, etc. But luckily, I'm pretty strong on our solution that we deliver to the marketplace, so that's good. But all I'm saying is I know this struggle is real, and there's plenty of other people like me who can't just adapt easily and comfortably and confidently to a new solution. And we need to take that into consideration as providers, because if you just were to put 100 people into a classroom of training and give them a full day's training on a new solution with new tactics, strategies, best practices, etc., you would get really mixed results because not everybody's going to be able to just adopt that and go away and use it comfortably and confidently. And there should be a lot more focus that goes on to identifying what levels of support the different people need and how much training different people need so that we can identify that up front and make sure they get the support that they need. And I'm not just talking about which button to press and which button to click over here and which page to go to. I'm talking about the best practice tactics and strategies. Because the customers in procurement, in the procurement world, the customers are obviously experts in procurement. They're experts in their industry and in their categories. However, we as providers, we're experts in the digitalization of procurement, and it's not always a one-to-one. So there's lots of best practice tactics and strategies as well as how to use the system that need to go into that training. And one approach that I find particularly useful is a more project-based approach to training. So rather than just a classroom training where you would deliver that training and then people would go off and when they're ready, use the tool, use the system to launch their projects. It's much more around actually with certain users at least to do that project-based approach where you're understanding what the first project is that they want to run through the system, understand it in depth, and then show them and give them training on exactly what they need to do in the system and how to do it with best practice, etc., in terms of tactics and strategies, all wrapped around so that then they can go away and do it and they can get hand-holding support as they're building their project through the tool as well, and then sign off from the customer success manager to say, yeah, you've done everything in line, and then like the support through the whole process, but based on the project, because that means that they're then able to go away and use the training that they've just got that was very specific to the project they're about to run. They go away and use that exact training, and that means that they're assimilating it much more because they're putting it straight into practice in a real life scenario, which just makes it stick much more. And one other thing I would say around training is that training should be layered. It's a journey. Somebody doesn't just start off as an amateur and go straight to a professional or an expert level. It's much more about making sure that people understand the more basic functionality and best practice tactics and strategies, and then from there build upon to the more intermediate levels, and then when they're ready, build to the more advanced levels. It shouldn't just be all delivered in one go.
Agreed. Alex, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I totally agree. And a lot of our members have been talking to us, particularly the shift to virtual environments has meant that like more bite-sized approaches, as you said, like stadial approaches to training is far more effective. It's very difficult to have someone paying attention to a virtual training course for an entire day. And that shift towards more bite-size is really interesting. Another thing which has come up a few times, we've got a really interesting case study from Rolls-Royce, for example, and a few other companies around the sort of culture recognition associated with training. And actually, there has to be more effort to sort of celebrate successes, profile high performers, ensure that suitable recognition of people who have actually done a really good job of either championing the solution or learning how to make use of it. And in their case, it's almost a gamified model. So, scores and awards and badges and all those sorts of things, which is obviously practiced by quite a lot of organizations. But that culture recognition is something I think we need to embed when we think about training and upskilling.
Yeah, definitely. So, no, definitely. And I'm just conscious, obviously, that we are kind of getting towards the end now of our session. But Dan, Alex, obviously, we've discussed quite a wide array of areas here. We've discussed, the partnerships. We've discussed, the different steps that are needed, for the change management. We've discussed, the government, the models, the process engineering, and we've also kind of discussed, that idea of buy-in and making sure, that it's basically the whole organization that takes part in this and not just, that one person forcing other people, to adopt a solution. But I was wondering, to kind of help take us home, so to speak, are there anything else that we may not have mentioned yet that should be taken into consideration? If our audience were to leave with, let's say, one or two main pieces of advice, next steps, what would these be? And Dan, I'm going to go to you first, and then Alex, you can wrap us up.
Well, there's a few things that I would say are key things to bear in mind. I'm not saying that they're takeaways, because I tried to give some takeaways earlier and I don't want to get back into the detail there, but just some high level things that I think that I haven't said yet and that haven't come up yet, but they've kind of been touched upon. I would definitely say when selecting to procurement functions who are selecting that provider, zoom out from the checklist of functionality approach, because lots of individual ticks on a page don't mean in reality that the system's going to work in an easy to use, intuitive way. It may be clunky, it could be difficult to use it. It may not be the right partner for the organization. And one of the things I would say within that is definitely test the system rigorously, because many times I think there's too much reliance put upon the system demonstration delivered by the provider, and somebody who's good at demoing systems, who's using a little bit of smoke and mirrors, can make something look a lot easier than it actually is in reality. And then there can be a nasty shock later on when you're rolling out the system that it's nowhere near as easy, as intuitive, and as efficient. So that's one thing. Really zoom out and make sure that you are selecting the absolute best provider, the best partner to ensure your success. And then I would also say, don't try to change too much in one go. There's often pressure, I think, from providers to do a big bang of transformation. And that can work in some situations, but just trying to do too much in one go is high risk. And what I highly recommend is that you start off, as I mentioned earlier, just focusing on the absolute key objectives and challenges. Find a solution, implement it, adopt it, embed it, and then grow to other areas and to the next tier of objectives and challenges with the next tier of solutions. And whether that's the same provider or another provider, the market, as Alex was saying, has moved to a much more best of breed approach. So you don't need one solution provider for everything. You can easily plug and play with other organizations' solutions, other providers' solutions, so that you can still get the integration and the benefit of the data being pushed and pulled throughout the different solutions, but it doesn't have to be with the same solution provider. So that's another thing I would say is just don't be forced into doing too much in one go, because that can definitely lead to a very expensive failure. And then the last thing I would say is just recognize that change is hard. and rewarded. I like what you were saying earlier, Alex, about incentivizing and gamifying, and then really rewarding people who are on board with the change. So yeah, incentivize the targets and incentivize it. But not just that, there should be a lot of recognition for those who take their time to support their colleagues to go through that change and to adopt a new tool as well, because that can be so helpful, having somebody who who works next to you, or whether it's remotely or in the same office, somebody who can actually just guide you from that side rather than always asking for help from the provider. That in itself can be really helpful. I could go on for much longer, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dan. Alex, any thoughts, any closing remarks here?
Well, I had a few. I really agree with a lot of what Dan was saying. I had a fun one, though. I had a good practice the other day, which I'll share. So one member we were talking to, as part of their change management strategy, decided to target their pilots always at the most resistant people to their digital change. I'm not saying that's best practice. I thought it was a really fun approach, with their idea being that, by bringing in individuals who are most resistant, when they're brought over, the rest of the organisation will follow. And I just thought that was quite a fun practice to finish on, perhaps.
Perfect. Brilliant. Well, look, guys, both of you, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure having you. Any questions that we didn't get to from our audience, we do apologize, but these will be transferred on to our speakers, who will do their best to get back to these questions. The recording and approved slides will be made available on demand. So, if you want to watch this again, or if you know that your colleagues registered and didn't get a chance to join us today, you will all be getting this recording, after the webinar. If you have any feedback, please submit this via our feedback form. We really do want to hear from you. And finally, for those who may not yet be aware, we are closing our Innovation in series next week with our Innovation in Asia Pacific. So don't forget to register for that. And again, a big thank you to Scanmarket for helping us put this session together. Dan, Alex, absolute pleasure working with you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. And everybody, thank you for joining us today. And we hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thanks so much.